like to tell you about one of my favorite pieces of home audio gear, a stereo hi-fi preamp. And it's a piece of gear that I use every day, even today. This is a Crown preamp, and it's a sleeper. A sleeper like a car that looks pretty ordinary but has extraordinary performance, unexpectedly good performance. The story goes that a handful of years ago I was in the market for a hi-fi stereo preamp. And there's a lot of preamps in the market, a lot of good equipment made by all sorts of manufacturers like Pioneer and Sony and NAD, Hafler. And as I was looking through all of my available options, the one that was obvious to me was Crown. I was using a Crown power amp, so I thought if I had a Crown preamp that would aesthetically fit in nicely. And I really like the Crown power amps. They're built with a real eye towards quality. And so the high quality just attracted me. And as I look at the available Crown preamps, now of course all of this equipment is vintage. It's been discontinued, so you can't buy it new, but you're looking through the used market. And as I'm looking through the available Crown preamps, well, the best preamp in the bunch to me seemed to be the SL2, the Straight Line 2, which was the last preamp that they had produced. And I thought that was a gorgeous piece of gear. And it gets really good reviews for having excellent sound. Unfortunately, it's also a bit coveted. It's really high quality, and so it commands a pretty high price, a higher price than I was willing to pay. I just could not find one at a price point that worked for me. So I look at the SL1, the prior model, and that seems even more rare than the SL2. And again, I couldn't find one at a reasonable price point, and I didn't like the aesthetic of the SL1 as much as the SL2. So I start looking at older models. And the prior generation was the IC150. And the original IC150 looked like a piece of equipment straight out of the 1960s with black plastic knobs and push buttons and so forth. And to me, the look of it just looked old, and it didn't really fit with my decor, so I kind of scratched that off the list. But then the IC150A, which was an upgrade to that unit, essentially the same unit, but they did a cosmetic upgrade mostly. And now they put it into a milled aluminum box with solid aluminum knobs, and it's a really nice piece of gear. And I like the look of that. And over the years, I've learned to appreciate the look even more and more. And I think it is a really sexy piece of equipment. And when you operate the Crown IC150A, it just oozes quality. When you operate the controls, they just feel like they're really high quality. It's the kind of equipment that you'd expect NASA to produce for their space program back in the late 60s. So I thought, that looks like a pretty good choice. But then I started looking into the reviews of this unit, and they weren't very good. Which is surprising because Crown has always had a reputation for relatively high performance audio equipment. But the IC150 and 150A at the time didn't get very good reviews for sonic quality. Now the unit would measure well on the bench. Spec-wise it had good specs. But when magazines like Stereophile came out or Stereo Review and people reviewed the unit, a lot of these golden-eared audiophiles would say that the unit had a grainy and harsh and fatiguing sound to it. Now, of course, I think we're talking about fringe audiophiles, and 9 out of 10 people listening to it would say, it sounds good, no problem. Sounds really good. But for those golden-eared audiophiles out there, they thought that it had a rather unpleasant tone characteristic to its sound. So that was disappointing because I want a preamp that's going to look good and sound good. But I looked into the IC150A preamp a little bit more on how it was built and how it was designed, and I got excited. Hey, if you find this content interesting, Please make sure to subscribe if you're not already subscribed so you can easily get back to the channel and catch more. I'd also encourage you to tag that bell icon so that you're notified when new content drops. The IC in IC150 refers to integrated circuit. And this unit was built around an integrated circuit amplifier. Now, in the past, they would build their own amplifiers completely from scratch with a whole bunch of transistors and capacitors and resistors and so on, and roll your own amplifier. But in the 1970s, when this unit came out, integrated circuit amplifiers were developed. And so you could get the entire amplifier on one little plastic chip. And that's, of course, commonly used today as well. And the advantage of this is that the variation from one chip to the next is very consistent. So you get consistent high performance by just dropping in a chip, and you get less unit-to-unit variation. Of course, it's also inexpensive. Once they've got the chip design in place, they can crank these things out at relatively low cost, and it's much less expensive than building your own amplifier out of a whole bunch of parts. And of course, as a manufacturer or a builder, it greatly simplifies the design because most of the work has been done right in that chip, and you just need to provide a handful of support components rather than a whole bunch of stuff building your own amplifier. And so as I looked into the IC150 preamp, I saw that it was a design of a preamp that was based around one single op-amp chip. The only amplification circuitry in this unit is that one op-amp chip and a couple transistors in the phono stage. And back in the early 1970s, the op-amp chips that they had to choose from weren't quite as refined as they are today. Over the last 40 plus years, we've made some pretty great advances in integrated circuits. And so I looked at this situation and thought, this could easily be changed out for a high performance part today, because the pinouts of the chip that is in this device share the same pinouts as modern semiconductors. And there's a handful of modern op-amp chips that are basically a drop-in replacement for the old ones that were in the IC150A preamp. Now, some of the modern op-amps have vastly greater performance and can amplify not only the audio spectrum, but even dipping into the radio frequency spectrum. They're so flat and linear. And so some of the modern op-amps might have a tendency to go into high frequency oscillation unless they have a little compensation added to them. So you might have to be a little bit careful about choosing just exactly which parts to substitute in order to get good performance and stability. Or you might have to do a couple little circuit tweaks in order to make sure that everything stays stable. Not a big deal. So upon learning this, I got the IC150A preamp, pulled out the old integrated circuit that was in it from the early 1970s, and dropped in a Burr Brown OPA series op-amp. And like I mentioned, there's a handful of different current op-amps that are highly regarded for having state-of-the-art sound quality, and they're not particularly expensive, a few dollars to maybe $15 a piece at most. And I chose the OPA series from Burr Brown just because it had a sound quality that was well appreciated by a lot of folks, and dropped it into the preamp. And now this unit performs with state-of-the-art performance because there is no other active electronics in the device other than that op-amp chip. All of the tone controls are completely passive, and all of the other controls in the unit are completely passive. And so those controls don't hardly at all affect the sound quality of the device. The sound quality is almost entirely determined by that op-amp chip. Now, of course, this is a pretty old vintage piece of gear, and so there might be some advantage in updating some of the capacitors that are signal coupling from one part of the circuit to another, but that's also super inexpensive. So replace the op-amp, replace a few capacitors, And now you've got this 1970s era preamp that performs at state-of-the-art levels. Pretty cool. So it looks great, it feels great, and it performs great. The other thing that I did with my unit was I added in a very small headphone amplifier driver board. Because there's no other amplification in the unit, the op-amp chip is also providing headphone drive. And those op-amp chips aren't really made to drive significant levels into a headphone. And so from our friends over in Asia, I was able to pick up a little circuit board that had a well-regarded headphone driver chip on it. It's about 1 inch square. And I just dropped that into the box as well to have a little bit of boost to the headphone side. So with those tiny modifications, the unit performs great now. And this is super easy to do, and it's really low cost. You know, I probably have an extra $25 into this unit in terms of parts in order to get the performance up to modern levels. But that's a tip for you, which is if you find a Crown IC150 preamp, with relatively little work, you can transform that preamp into something that has terrific levels of performance.